okay?
Sure.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Let's Talk Clay County. I'm your host, David Rich. I have a recurring guest on this show and a multitude of other shows of mine, Dr. Mary Ruwart, who is a PhD in biophysics and spent 19 years at a pharmaceutical company and has written a couple books. I've read both of them. I'm rereading one, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, called Death by Regulation. Now, I think that my liberal friends are going to get mad at me over this, and I don't really care because I'm more interested in truth and facts than I am agenda. We all, I don't know anybody on the other side of the aisle who thinks that the federal government is like always doing the right thing, because that's not even close to being true. So we have her on today to discuss this book, Death by Regulation. Want to just give us a real quick synopsis as what motivated you to? And I know we're going to start, like, I know the thalidomide. Am I saying that right?
Thalidomide.
Thalidomide. That rolls off the tongue better, I guess. Okay. May I just read the first paragraph? I guess that kind of sums it up. Is that okay?
You can, yes. I mean, basically, I'm saying that the FDA's shave 5 to 10 years off each of our lives.
Right.
It's in other words, it's not doing what it was meant to do. Right. And mostly it's because of the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act, although there are a few other things that came on board that didn't help.
Right. Yeah. So I'm going to read this first paragraph because, I mean, your awareness of it started. I'm saying this is you as a child, right?
Yes. I was about 11 or 12, I think.
11 or 12. So it starts off, the very beginning of the book, the first paragraph says, I was just a child when the heart-rending pictures of thalidomide babies missing one or more limbs, wow, appeared in Life magazine. Their deformities were caused by a new drug, thalidomide, which their mothers had taken in early pregnancy, usually to lessen their morning sickness. Those deformities evoked deep compassion in me. Even at my young age, I knew such children would have a more difficult life than would youngsters with normal limbs, which is definitely true. And that's a pretty young age to become aware of something as atrocious as that. Go ahead and tell us about that drug and what happened.
Well, the pictures were pretty horrific. I mean, they had a whole spread, and it was in Europe. It happened primarily in Europe, although I think there were 17 children affected here because it wasn't testing here. And it was a safer sleeping drug than barbiturates. I'm sure you probably have heard stories about people who have accidentally overdosed from barbiturates. So people were pretty excited about this, and it was safe for, adults, but not so much for children. But back then, our science didn't really recognize how sensitive the babies were when they're in utero to drugs that the mother would take. And so what happened is women would take thalidomide, maybe to sleep, or maybe because their husband had it for, sleeping pill, and found out that it really helped their morning sickness. And so the companies started selling it for that in Europe. But the problem is that if it was taken, I think it was kind of a narrow window actually, but it was taken in the first something like 2 or 3 weeks to 6 to 8 weeks of pregnancy, then there was a good chance that the babies would have these deformities, which basically meant missing limbs, or sometimes they just were stillborn. And because of there's a 9-month delay before you see this. And so it took a while for Europe to experience this and realize what it was. And in the meantime, in the United States, the FDA was able to stop it, not because of this, not because it had an effect on the children, but because it also has another side effect, peripheral neuropathy, which means that the limbs have, nerve damage, which kind of makes sense since missing limbs were the problem with the thalidomide babies. And so it was very tragic, especially in Europe. And I said like about 17, I think the number is very close to that, but I don't know if it's exact. That was about what it was in the US. The lesson to be learned here was that the FDA had enough power to stop the drug for a side effect. And in Europe, it wasn't stopped because, like I said, the science wasn't good enough to recognize that immediately. Now what we do is we test most drugs in pregnant animals to make sure, well, as sure as we can be that this isn't going to happen in humans. And I say that because, the animal studies only give us about 50% surety on things like this. So, and so as a consequence, we often actually test in primates so that, we have a reasonable assurance that we're not going to have a problem with this, a new drug of this type of thing. But the problem is, after that, the American public really wanted to be reassured that, drugs were safe. But, no drug is perfectly safe. It will always, we always have side effects. It's just the way life is. And so these 1962 amendments have been floating around in Congress for 3 or 4 years, and they really weren't directed at safety at all. They were directed at effectiveness because Senator Kefauver thought that if he was able to make drug companies show that the generic drugs were equivalent to and just as effective as the brand name drugs, that people would buy generic, because they didn't buy generic because that wasn't always true. They weren't always equivalent. And in some cases, that made a big difference.
Yeah, the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the 1938 Food and Drug Act in 1962?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So who are these people? Are these senators or congressmen or something?
Yeah, the senator was Kefauver, and like I said, his idea was if generic drugs were tested for effectiveness and were shown to be equivalent to a branded drug, a brand name drug, then people would buy generic. Back then, people didn't, because actually most of them weren't equivalent. And so if you had something like insulin, you wanted to something, that was, you had to have it and know the dose and be very careful with it, then you couldn't risk taking the generic. The thing is, this act was more than that, though. It gave the FDA power over manufacturing, advertising, and by advertising, I don't just mean ads that might appear on TV or whatever, but what you could tell doctors about the drug. It was very specific. The FDA went back and forth a lot on this, and so. And the effectiveness studies, the standard that the FDA decided to use was actually very costly. 2 U.S. clinical studies, that means in humans, that showed significance at what we call in science the p less than 0.05, which means that you have a 95% surety from statistics that what you're seeing is real.
Well, that's pretty high.
Yeah, and so what happened is these studies took so long that instead of being 4 years to go from the lab bench to the marketplace, it became 14 years. It added 10 years. So people died waiting for life-saving drugs in the U.S., while in Britain, where actually they had a lot of thalidomide babies, they did something different. What they did is they made sure they did what we call post-marketing studies. So what they did is they paid attention to what happened when the drug went out in the general public, because they knew what we know today was true. That is that the safety that we were measuring pre-1962 was basically equivalent to what safety we measured after 62, because the problem is when we were talking about earlier, you can't predict everything from animal studies. You can't predict from the small clinical studies that you do. So when it gets out in the general public and people with different genetics and environment and things like that get the drug, you see things that you didn't see in the clinical trials. And so the safety difference is no different between the 4 and the 14 years of study, even though you might initially think, well, if it's more studies, so it's got to be safer. But that did not turn out to be true.
Yeah, I mean, strikes me as like, you arbitrarily add that number of years onto legally required amount of time to study, to conduct studies. You as professional scientists with PhDs and whatnot, they know when they've exhausted the amount of studies that can show them the data that they need to be that they need to see, right? Okay, so that could take 2 years, it could take 4 years, it might take 14 years. But I mean, if it doesn't, if it happens, let's say it happens in 4 years, under the legal requirement to extend it for 10 more years, what do you guys do? Like, do you just sit around? I mean, it sounds like a waste of like labor, time, money, energy. Like, okay, well, let's just make up some cockamamie study because we have 10 more years. Like, what do you do?
Oh, well, see, it doesn't work like that. What it is the FDA tells you what studies you have to do.
Oh.
And then when it looks at that result, it might say, FDA might say, well, you got to do another study because we thought of this other thing that you really should look at. And the reason it does that is because what would happen after the 62 amendments is somebody had to sign on the dotted line, I approve this drug from the FDA, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if there's any side effects, Congress would quite brutally kind of beat up on the FDA. Why did you approve this drug? It has this side effect. Well, every drug has side effects. So if they approved anything, they were putting their neck almost literally on the chopping block, at least the job chopping block. So of course they had disincentive to approve anything. And they did approve some things, of course, but they tried to think of any study they could that the pharmaceutical company had to do so that if they got called in front of Congress, they could say, well, we made them do this study and that study and this study, and, we did everything we could. And you can understand that. So the Congress that was the funder was what the FDA was really concerned about, not the American public, the Congress. And I mention that because what happened is the FDA continued to demand more studies, and it also tried to move out into medical practice and tried to really control that. And one of the big things that's a really, in my opinion, a really big problem is what they did with stem cell research. That is the new frontier of helping people, really. And what happened is, I'll give you, real life example. So, for example, there was this young man who had an accident with a nail gun. He basically got shot through the heart. Oh. Well, this is like very bad. And so he went to the hospital. His heart's damaged. And when you damage your heart like that, you may have multiple heart attacks and then die because the heart isn't functioning properly, right? So in desperation, what the doctors did, this was in Royal Oak, Michigan, in Beaumont Hospital, they gave him stem cells, thinking, well, what can we do? And they took them from this young man's, I think his hip, his bone marrow, and gave them to the heart, and it worked. It was beautiful, and in 4 months he was out playing basketball. So this was great. And the doctor said, hey, what we should do is do this clinical study where we take heart attack patients, patients that have cardiovascular disease, and half of them are only going to live for a year. And what we should do is give them stem cells. But the FDA said, no, you can't do that because we don't know enough about it. So what you have to do is first you have to do animal studies. Well, this is a hospital, okay? They don't have animal facilities.
Right.
So they couldn't do that. And there were some other requirements too. So they couldn't do that. Well, then it got worse, if you can imagine this. So there was a gentleman in Colorado, Dr. Centro, and he was, I think I might have not pronounced his name quite right, but anyhow, he was doing a lot of work with athletes. And so what he was finding is that he could basically prevent having to do surgery on their knee or their hip or whatever by giving them stem cells. And yet, when he had older people and he did the same procedure, he found out, well, there's not enough stem cells. And of course, that makes sense because you make a lot when you're young and not so much when you're older. So he grew up the stem cells in a test tube, basically. And about 5 days later, he'd give them back to the older people, and that would work. But the FDA came in and said, can't do that. As long as you put the stem cells back the same day, it's medical practice. But if you grow them up in a test tube and then put them back, it's a drug. And so, yeah, so if you're an older person and you want to have stem cells, some type of stem cell treatment, and you figure you're going to need to have your stem cells grown for 5 days before you get them back, you have to go into the Caribbean or overseas to get it done. You can't do it in the US. So, yeah, so they've encroached on, just not on drugs, which I could, as you know, I went on and on in the book about that, but also in medical practice and prevention. That's another thing. See, even if you know that a vitamin or mineral will help a particular disease, if you say that or try to say that, then according to the FDA, you've made it a drug. And that is even true for foods. So the FDA sent out warning letters to cherry growers and walnut growers and said, hey, your product is a drug now, because you put on your website that there were studies done of the ingredients that are in your food, and you made health claims for them. You said they might be able to help in this and this and this, or you just put the publication up there on your website about this component or compound that's in your foods, that it might be helpful, that it's been shown in mice or whatever to be helpful, and humans to be helpful. And so, we're going to shut you down if you don't take all that information down. So they did. and it's ridiculous when you think about it, because we need to eat or we don't live.
True.
Therefore, there are components in food that interact in our body to give us health and prevent disease.
Ta-da. Kind of a no-brainer there.
Yeah.
And I think I mentioned this last time you were on, is I worked for a health food store a long time ago, and I remember the owner said, if you're going to recommend any sort of supplement, there's certain ways you can't say it, and
Yes.
This will do it, first of all, is one way. You can't be that certain about it. But I don't see the problem saying it might help. Because that's vague enough to apply to almost anything, first of all. So secondly, there have been there's herbology and all sorts of, this is millennia old practices. I mean, I'm trying to think of the what is it called? The practice in oh gosh, what is it? Whatever, something in India. It's over 2,000 years old, and people
Ayurveda, is that?
Yeah, Ayurveda, exactly. That's it. Yes, and they've been doing it for over 2,000 years, and unless you think that they're all just really stupid people for 2,000 years, which was rude and offensive and most likely not true. There's probably something to it.
Yes.
You can set your standards too high, where you start bracketing off, you marginalizing statistical distributions and efficacy of things that do work. And it might be just in a supplemental way. JFK Jr. got lambasted because with the measles thing in Texas, he said, well, vitamin A helps with that too, which is true. And he didn't say only take vitamin A. He didn't say that. But everybody's treating it like that's what he said, just take vitamin A. He never said just. He never said that. Okay. It does help. And that's been shown in multiple experiences, actual medical things, encounters, and in clinical studies. That's true. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes.
Right?
And in fact, COVID, very few, I don't think there were any reports of people with high vitamin D levels dying from COVID. There was,
yeah, I've heard that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that makes sense in many ways, because, it's really a hormone. It's not a typical vitamin. And
vitamin D?
Vitamin D, yeah. And it influences a lot of things, yes.
Huh.
And really, I don't know, other vitamins might act as hormones too. We might be on the show 10 years from now, and I might be pointing to another one. But anyhow, vitamin D is, in fact, there was one publication where the guy said, based on his review of the literature, that if we doubled our dose of vitamin, or our blood levels of vitamin D, and took enough supplementation to do that we would probably gain 2 years of life on average.
Wow.
And that's because if you have low vitamin D, you're susceptible to heart disease, cancer, etc. It's just like everything is, because your body isn't working quite right at that low level.
Right.
And that's why I think they had such a good response with COVID too, with vitamin D. But you didn't hear our health agencies saying, take vitamin D, it'll help, or get out in the fresh air and exercise, it'll help. And yet all those things are very likely to help. And
Yeah, absolutely. Even if they just make you feel better, but I mean, there's more to it than just that. But I mean, feeling better is, isn't it like the absolute measure of, or like a high measure of health? I told that to my GP once. I'm like, you know what the ultimate measure of health is? He's like, what? I'm like, happiness. I'm like, so. But anyway, that's not exactly right, but it's up there. Now, I just want to read this real quick because we got about 10 minutes. You may be asking yourself, if the amendments have had such a dire impact, why haven't I heard about it before? You say something about without insider information about how the amendments act behind the scenes, even a dedicated journalist would have a difficult time putting the story together. That's a very interesting point. I mean, just the complexity of what goes on at the federal level, and the access to specific information amongst this like complicated web of stuff going on, just in principle, in theory, is very difficult to get to. And plus, you're just listening to what when you ask a federal official or employee what's going on, and you just kind of have to believe what they tell you. You don't have to, but you're not going to get into like the actual direct data set and what the mathematical and scientific analysis is. Somebody from the FDA is going to tell you what's up, right?
Yes, and the thing is, the people that know all this, people who work in the industry, are not going to say anything as long as they're employed there, because if they do, the FDA will punish their company. When I presented some of this data in scientific meetings, I had so many people come up to me. Of course, this is after I left Upjohn. I had so many people come up to me and say, I'm so glad you're speaking out, because we can't, if we did that, we would, our company wouldn't be able to get approvals anymore. They just stall on reviewing your application. They can choose winners and losers. And, that means that there's the possibility of a lot of corruption, because
Oh yeah.
they know where the stock's going to go if they make an approval. So it's and I'm not saying that all of the FDA examiners do that, but I mean, it's a temptation, right? I mean, people are people, they'll do things to help their bottom line. And speaking of that, so one of the things that happened in 1992 is Congress passed the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. What that did is it allowed the FDA to charge what they called a user fee for hiring more FDA examiners, so that they could shorten the time that the FDA took to review all those 14 years of data. And it did, shorten it for a year. But the problem is, it started out as like $100,000 a year, which in drug development terms isn't very much. I think now it's really close to $3 million, and so something like over 70%. And this is dated. This is like 2017 or 18 numbers. So back then, 70% of the salaries of the people who look at the data and approve drugs are paid for by the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. Man. So when Vioxx came around and the examiner went to his boss and said, we cannot approve this, it causes heart attacks, what he was told by his boss is, our client is the pharmaceutical firms, so we are going to approve it. And they did. Wow. And yeah, and this guy was really a hero. He went to a national science meeting and presented his data, and of course blew the whistle on this whole thing. But it didn't happen for several years. I think it was about 4 or 5 years before he did that. And when he did that, then the company took it off the market. They did not wait for the FDA, because now, of course, there's a liability. So in fact, the FDA left a similar compound on the market which did have similar but not as great an effect on heart attacks. So this was, this, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's good to have such a compound. Some compounds work really well without side effects, some don't. But the problem is we don't know who's going to be the lucky winners in that lottery.
Right.
So it's not something you take lightly. I mean, there are times when people are dying and they'll take, they want to try whatever they can try because their options are very limited. And, they should have that choice if they want to. And many times people have wanted that choice, have begged Congress, have begged the FDA, let me take this drug, even though it's not approved, because I'm going to die. and they've been denied. And what happens is the FDA denies until it's like a week before their death. Then because they want to check the box that they have, 90%, that 90% of the time they will approve having what they call this compassionate use. Then they give permission, but it's too late. And, that's not good. And of course, the right to try that was passed by President Trump in his last term, I mean, it's a wonderful thing, but here's the problem. It goes around the FDA. It's between the patient and the pharmaceutical company. So if the pharmaceutical company gives the patient the drug, you can imagine that they may not be on the good side of the FDA anymore. And it would be the same thing as if they spoke out against the FDA. So,
right.
That's a problem. And, earlier, David, you were asking me why I wrote the book. Well, there's not a whole lot of people that could have written that book.
That can what?
There's not a whole lot of people that could have written that book.
Correct.
That have the knowledge. It's just specialized knowledge, and maybe there's a handful of people who could have written it. So that's why I wrote it, because I feel like it's important information. And people have a lot of misconception about, how the drug companies work. And because of the way the 62 amendments were implemented, basically, the FDA ran roughshod over the industry and basically banned a bunch of things without giving the pharmaceutical companies time to meet the new requirements. And of course, when you have that kind of thing happening, you get the impression that, hey, they're acting unethically. So maybe that's what I need to do in order to keep my company afloat. And that's part of what we're seeing today. Like when I was at Upjohn, for example, we in the science part of the company generally made the decisions about which drugs to develop. But a few years after I came there, so we'd probably be like around 1980, we no longer were allowed by the bean counters to develop something that wasn't patentable because it was too costly by that time. And also, I think there was as I said, I think the whole landscape changed so much, and it was, I think, felt in the industry that the regulators were not being fair, that I think the MBAs that stepped in and sort of took over on which drugs would be developed had a very different philosophy than the scientists did.
Oh, I would imagine. They're in it for the cash.
Well, and it was getting more expensive. I have to say, I can understand their point, because it became so expensive to get an FDA approval that they would kill life-saving drugs before they even got started, because we wouldn't be able to recover the cost of getting that FDA approval.
Wow, that's nuts. Okay. We're about a half hour down. So that's all extremely informative and insightful and profoundly disturbing. To think that that's what's going on. And I was thinking of like other connections I make in my head. I don't have them empirically verified, but like, sort of like you have, okay. So chapter 3, you have the FDA is given carte blanche. You talked a little bit about that, but this is what I want to talk about next time: revolving door swings between drug companies and the FDA. I know that's got to be some juicy stuff there. Right. That it almost sounds like the FDA is catering to the biggest spender or something like that.
Yes, to some
right.
extent, that's true. They like working with the big guys because they know them. You know,
Right.
they're around more than a small company. A small company might have one drug of the pipeline. The big ones might have a dozen.
Right. Right. Okay. Always follow the money, as they say. So, all right, Dr. Mary Ruwart, thanks again for coming on. We're going to have you on a bunch more times to talk more about this book. You have another book too. I don't recall the Healing. What was the Compassion Libertarian? What is it called? Healing the World.
Healing Our World: The Compassion of Libertarianism.
Right, which I read a couple years ago. I'm fixed on your death by regulation, so I'll do that too. Maybe we can talk about that later. The other one later. So thank you so much for coming on. This is Let's Talk Lake County, everybody. I'm your host, David Rich. We'll see you next time. Mary, hold on one second.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. All right, hold on. There's a